The morning had started like any other patrol. Captain Jake Morrison led his company of 280 Marines through the dense Vietnamese jungle, sweat soaking through their uniforms in the oppressive heat. Birds called from the canopy above, and the humid air hung thick with the smell of wet earth and vegetation. Morrison wiped his brow, scanning the tree line with experienced eyes. Something felt wrong. The jungle had gone too quiet. "Captain, you seeing this?" Sergeant First Class David Reed whispered, pointing to fresh boot prints in the mud. Before Morrison could respond, the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The distinctive crack of AK-47s shattered the silence as bullets tore through leaves and branches. "Contact! Contact! We're surrounded!" voices screamed over the radio. Morrison dove behind a fallen log as his Marines scrambled for whatever cover they could find. "Return fire! Get those machine guns up!" he roared, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the deafening chaos. This wasn't a random engagement. It was a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had waited until the Marines were in a natural kill zone, trapped in a small valley with high ground on three sides. Private First Class Tommy Jenkins, barely 20 years old, pressed himself against a tree, his hands shaking as he fired blindly into the jungle. Next to him, Corporal Maria Santos took careful aim, her training overriding her fear. "Controlled bursts, Jenkins. Make every round count." But her words were cut short as mortar rounds began falling from the sky. The first explosion threw 3 Marines into the air like rag dolls. The second hit directly in the center of their formation, creating a crater where Sergeant Williams and his fire team had been standing seconds before. Dirt and shrapnel filled the air. Morrison's ears rang as he grabbed his radio handset, trying to call for air support, for artillery, for anything. "Phantom 6 to Firebase Delta, we are under heavy fire. Request immediate." Another explosion cut him off. He looked down at the radio in his hands. It was sparking, a piece of shrapnel embedded in its center. Their lifeline to the outside world was dead. "Sir, we can't hold this position." Sergeant Reed crawled up beside him, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "We've got casualties everywhere and they're closing in." Morrison's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and losing men by the second. Through the smoke and chaos, he spotted it, the river, about 200 yards to their east. It was wide and dangerous, but it was their only chance. "Fall back to the river," he shouted, pointing toward the water. "Fighting retreat, cover each other." The Marines began their desperate withdrawal, carrying their wounded, laying down suppressive fire as they moved. Machine gunner Lance Corporal Davis stood his ground, his M240 roaring as he gave his brothers time to retreat. An RPG streaked toward him, but he didn't flinch, continuing to fire until the rocket hit. His sacrifice bought them 30 precious seconds. They reached the river's edge, a churning, muddy torrent swollen from recent rains. It was at least 50 yards wide, and Morrison could see the current was strong. But behind them, the insurgents were closing in, their victory shouts growing louder. "Into the water! Move, move, move!" Morrison ordered. The Marines plunged into the river, struggling against the current while trying to keep their weapons above water. The wounded were supported by their brothers, some barely conscious as they were dragged across. Morrison was halfway across, helping a young Marine with a leg wound when he heard the whistling sound. His blood turned to ice. Incoming. The artillery shell hit the river behind them with devastating force. The explosion created a massive waterspout, and the shockwave threw Marines in every direction. Morrison felt himself lifted and thrown forward, his grip on the wounded Marine torn away. He surfaced, gasping, searching frantically for his men. Bodies floated in the water. Equipment sank into the murky depths, and among the casualties was their last working radio, sparking as it disappeared beneath the surface. Those who survived struggled to the far bank, pulling themselves onto the muddy shore, coughing up river water. Morrison counted heads as his Marines collapsed around him, exhausted, bleeding, traumatized. They'd lost 32 men in the crossing alone. He looked back across the river. Enemy soldiers were already lining the opposite bank, their weapons pointed at the Marines but holding fire. They didn't need to attack anymore. The river had risen even higher from the artillery impact, making it impassable. The Marines were trapped on a narrow strip of land with the swollen river at their backs and enemy-controlled territory on 3 sides. Sergeant Maria Chen, the unit's senior combat medic, was already moving among the wounded. "Captain, I've got 47 casualties and I'm almost out of supplies," she reported, her voice tight with stress. Morrison stared at the raging water that separated them from safety, then at his exhausted, bleeding Marines. They were cut off, with no communications, limited ammunition, and no way home. 15 miles away at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, commanders would soon realize an entire company had vanished into hostile territory. But Morrison's immediate concern wasn't rescue, it was survival. As the sun began to set on their first day of isolation, he gathered his remaining NCOs. "Dig in, prepare for a long fight, and pray someone realizes we're missing." The jungle grew dark around them, and in the distance, they could hear enemy forces moving into position, surrounding them like a noose slowly tightening. The ambush had been devastating, but Morrison feared the worst was yet to come. The first night was a living nightmare. Sergeant Maria Chen moved from casualty to casualty in the darkness, her headlamp casting eerie shadows as she worked with trembling hands. The wounded lay scattered across the muddy riverbank, their groans and labored breathing creating a chorus of suffering that would haunt her forever. "Corpsman up, we need help over here." The desperate calls never stopped coming. Private Rodriguez clutched his chest, blood bubbling between his fingers with each breath. A sucking chest wound, one of the worst injuries in combat. Chen dropped beside him, her medical kit already open. "Stay with me, Rodriguez. I've got you." She worked quickly, sealing the wound with an occlusive dressing, her supplies dwindling with each Marine she treated. Around her, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Lance Corporal Peterson had shrapnel embedded in his abdomen. Sergeant Williams was going into shock from blood loss. Private Jenkins had a compound fracture, the bone protruding through his torn uniform, and these were just the critical cases. Chen's hands shook as she inventoried what remained in her medical bag. 3 bandages, 2 morphine syringes, 1 IV bag, some gauze and medical tape. That was it. She had 47 wounded Marines and enough supplies to treat maybe 5 properly. "Sergeant Chen, Thompson's getting worse," Corporal Santos called out, her voice cracking. Chen rushed over to find Private Thompson burning with fever, his earlier leg wound now red and inflamed. Infection, the silent killer in jungle warfare, was already setting in. Captain Morrison stood at the river's edge, staring across the dark water with binoculars. Through his night vision, he could see enemy soldiers moving along the opposite bank. They'd set up positions every 100 yards, watching and waiting. The river had risen another 2 feet since the crossing, turning into a raging torrent that glowed an eerie green through his optics. "Perimeter report," he said quietly to Sergeant Reed, who appeared beside him like a ghost. "We've got listening posts set up at 50-yard intervals, sir, but we're spread thin, real thin. If they hit us hard, I don't know if we can hold." Reed paused, his jaw tight. "We lost count of how many rounds each man has left. Maybe 3 magazines average. Some guys are down to 1. Morrison nodded grimly. 3 magazines, against an enemy force that could number in the hundreds, possibly thousands. The math was simple and brutal. "And the wounded?" Morrison asked, though he dreaded the answer. 2 more died in the last hour, sir. Chen's doing everything she can, but—" Reed didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to wounded men without proper medical care in the jungle. As dawn broke on their first full day of isolation, Morrison called together his remaining squad leaders. 9 men gathered in a tight circle, their faces gaunt and streaked with mud. These were his best, hardened Marines who'd seen combat before, but he could see the fear in their eyes. "Okay, here's where we stand," Morrison began, his voice low but steady. "We're cut off. No comms, limited ammo, 45 wounded and counting. The river's impassable and we've got hostile forces on 3 sides." "What about trying to move at night, sir?" suggested Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Maybe we could slip through their lines, make it back to friendly territory." "With 45 wounded men," Morrison shook his head, "we'd have to leave them, and that's not happening. We don't leave our people behind." "So what's the plan, Captain?" Reed asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We hold this position. We conserve ammunition. We treat our wounded as best we can. And we hope to God that command realizes we're missing and sends someone looking." The men exchanged glances. Hope wasn't much of a strategy, but it was all they had. By midday, the jungle heat became unbearable. The wounded suffered terribly, their dehydration worsening by the hour. Chen had set up a makeshift aid station under a large tree, but without proper medicine, clean water, or surgical equipment, it was little more than a place for men to die with some dignity. "Water, please," Private Rodriguez whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding. Chen held a canteen to his mouth, rationing the precious liquid. They'd been filtering river water, but it wasn't enough, and the risk of disease was high. "Small sips, Rodriguez, that's it." She looked up as another Marine was carried in, his leg mangled by shrapnel. "Oh God, not another one," she whispered, fighting back tears. She was a combat medic, trained for this, but nothing could prepare anyone for watching men die slowly when the supplies to save them were just 15 miles away. Morrison watched Chen work from a distance, admiring her courage even as he saw her breaking down. She hadn't slept in over 30 hours. Her uniform was stained with blood from a dozen different Marines. And still, she kept moving, kept fighting to save every life she could. That afternoon, Morrison sent out 3-man scout teams to probe for a possible escape route. They returned within hours with devastating news. "Sir, we're completely boxed in," reported Corporal Hayes, pointing to a crude map he'd drawn in the mud. "Enemy positions here, here, and here. They've got heavy machine guns covering the high ground. There's no way through without taking massive casualties." "What about to the south?" "Swamp, sir. Impassable. We'd bog down in minutes and they'd pick us off like sitting ducks." Morrison stared at the map, searching for options that didn't exist. They were in a perfect natural prison, the river behind them, enemy forces in front, and terrain that prevented maneuver on both flanks. As the second night approached, Morrison did the math he'd been avoiding. They'd lost 32 in the initial fighting and river crossing. Another 8 had died from their wounds. That left 240 Marines, nearly 50 of them unable to fight, against an enemy force that seemed to grow by the hour. Sergeant Chen approached, her face pale in the fading light. "Captain, we need to talk." Morrison knew what was coming. "Thompson died 20 minutes ago. Peterson's going septic, he'll be gone by morning. Rodriguez needs a chest tube or he'll drown in his own blood." Her voice broke. "Sir, I'm watching these men die from wounds that are completely treatable. If we were at a field hospital, they'd all survive. But here—" She gestured helplessly at her nearly empty medical bag. Morrison put a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing everything possible, Sergeant. No one could ask for more." "It's not enough." Chen's composure finally shattered. "I became a medic to save lives, and all I'm doing is watching them slip away." Before Morrison could respond, a single gunshot cracked across the river. Both Marines dropped instinctively, weapons ready. But it wasn't an attack, it was a message. An enemy soldier stood visible on the far bank, pointing at the trapped Marines, then drawing a finger across his throat. The message was clear: you're already dead, it's just a matter of time. That night, Morrison stood watch while his exhausted Marines tried to sleep. The jungle sounds seemed to mock them, the rush of the impassable river, the distant voices of enemy soldiers, the groans of dying men. He thought about his wife, his two daughters back home who believed their father was safe on a routine peacekeeping mission. 15 miles away, at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, alarm bells were finally beginning to ring. Captain Morrison's company had missed 2 scheduled check-ins. Their last known position was going dark, and in the operations center, a young Navy corpsman named Sarah Reeves was about to hear news that would change everything. But Morrison didn't know help might be coming. All he knew was that another Marine had just died, and the sun would rise on another day of slow death in the jungle. How many more would they lose before someone realized they were gone? The answer, he feared, was all of them. 15 miles away, the operations center at Forward Operating Base Sentinel erupted into controlled chaos. Red lights flashed across the tactical display board as Commander Patricia Holbrook stood rigid, staring at the map where Captain Morrison's company should have been. 2 missed check-ins, ma'am, reported Lieutenant Collins, his voice tense. Last known position here. He pointed to a sector deep in hostile territory. They were conducting a routine patrol through the valley corridor. Routine? Holbrook's eyes narrowed. There's nothing routine about that sector. It's crawling with insurgents. She grabbed the radio handset. Get me aerial reconnaissance. I want satellite imagery of that entire grid square. And spin up a quick reaction force now. Navy Corpsman Second Class Sarah Reeves was in the medical bay, restocking supplies, when she heard the commotion. Something in her gut twisted. She dropped what she was doing and sprinted toward the operations center, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. She burst through the door just as Holbrook was receiving the first satellite images. "Commander, what's happening?" "Reeves, you shouldn't be," Holbrook started, but Sarah had already seen the designation on the map. "Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion." Her blood turned to ice. "That's my brother's unit." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Jake Morrison, Captain Jake Morrison is my brother." The room went silent. Everyone knew what 2 missed check-ins meant in hostile territory. Holbrook's expression softened, but only slightly. "Corpsman, I need you to step outside while we—" "No." Sarah moved to the table, her eyes scanning the maps with professional intensity. 5 years as a combat medic, 3 deployments, specialized training in hostile environment medicine. Her mind was already working the problem. "Show me everything you have." Holbrook hesitated, then nodded to Collins. The satellite images appeared on the screen. Sarah's trained eye immediately caught it, a cluster of heat signatures on the far side of a swollen river, boxed in on 3 sides. "There, that's them." "We've identified the position," Holbrook confirmed. "But mounting a conventional rescue operation through that terrain—" She pulled up topographical maps showing the enemy-held territory between Fob Sentinel and the trapped Marines. "We'd need to push a full battalion through here, here, and here. Minimum 3 days to organize and execute, probably 4. "They don't have 4 days," Sarah said flatly, studying the images. She could see what the others might miss, the small shapes that were likely wounded Marines, the defensive positions that suggested they were under siege. "Commander, with that many heat signatures clustered together, they've got mass casualties. In jungle conditions without proper medical supplies, infections will set in within 48 hours. They're probably already past that point." "We're doing everything we can," Holbrook began, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes had locked onto something on the map, a thin line cutting through the mountains between Fob Sentinel and her brother's position. "What's this?" She traced the route with her finger. "Abandoned smuggling route through the Key Sand Pass," Lieutenant Collins answered. "Locals used it decades ago, but it's considered too dangerous now. Insurgents don't bother patrolling it because the terrain is so treacherous." Sarah's mind raced. She'd run mountain operations before, had trained specifically for high-altitude infiltration. How long would it take to traverse? For a full unit, impossible. The pass is barely wide enough for single file, there are sheer drops on both sides, and Collins stopped as he realized what she was suggesting. You can't be serious. One person could make it. Sarah's voice was steady, but her heart hammered. Light pack, night movement, avoiding enemy positions. I could be there in 12 hours. Absolutely not. Holbrook's tone was final. That's a suicide mission, Corpsman. The pass alone could kill you, and that's before we factor in enemy patrols, wildlife, and the fact that you'd be completely alone in hostile territory. Those Marines will die without immediate medical intervention. Sarah locked eyes with the commander. I've studied their position. They're trapped against a river with no escape route. Every hour we wait, more of them die from treatable wounds. Sir, I can carry enough medical supplies to stabilize the critical casualties and communications equipment to coordinate a proper extraction. And if you're captured, Holbrook challenged, if you're killed, we'd lose you and still have 280 Marines trapped. If we do nothing, we lose all of them. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. Commander, my brother is out there, but even if he wasn't, those are United States Marines dying because they can't get medical help. I took an oath, the same one you did. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Staff Sergeant Williams, a grizzled Special Operations veteran, spoke up from the corner. Ma'am, if I may, the corpsman's right about one thing. A single operator has a better chance of infiltrating through that terrain than a full squad. Smaller profile, faster movement, less chance of detection. It's still suicide, Holbrook insisted, but Sarah could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. Then make it count. Sarah stepped closer to the table, pointing at the map. I know this terrain. I ran operations in these mountains 8 months ago. I know the insurgent patrol patterns, the blind spots in their coverage, the water sources along the route. She pulled out a detailed topographical map from the archives, one she'd annotated herself during previous missions. See here, there's a cave system that runs parallel to the pass for about 2 clicks. I can use it to bypass their heaviest concentrations. Here, this ridge provides cover from aerial observation, and this stream, if I follow it north, it brings me within 1 click of their position. The room was silent as the officers studied her route. It was insane, threading through miles of enemy territory, across some of the most dangerous terrain in the region, carrying enough equipment to make a difference. But it was also the only plan that had any chance of reaching the Marines in time. What would you carry? Holbrook asked quietly, and Sarah knew she'd won. Compact trauma kit, antibiotics, IV fluids, surgical supplies, blood clotting agents, encrypted radio with satellite uplink, GPS beacon for extraction coordinates, minimal weapons, suppressed sidearm knife, 48 hours of rations and water, total pack weight around 40 pounds. 40 pounds through mountain passes in the dark, Lieutenant Collins muttered. That's insane. That's necessary, Sarah corrected. She turned back to Holbrook. Commander, give me 12 hours. If I'm not in position by then, proceed with the conventional rescue. But those Marines need help now, and I'm the only one who can get it to them in time. Holbrook stood silent for a long moment, the weight of 280 lives pressing down on her decision. Finally, she nodded. You have a go, but Reeves, you follow protocol to the letter. Radio check-ins every 2 hours. If you're compromised, you extract immediately. And if this goes sideways... She didn't finish, but both women understood. There would be no rescue for the rescuer. Understood, ma'am. Sarah felt adrenaline surge through her veins, mixing with fear and determination. Williams, get her kitted out. Collins, brief her on latest enemy positions and movements. And someone get me the weather forecast. I want to know exactly what conditions she's walking into. The operations center exploded into activity. Sarah was ushered into the armory where specialized equipment was laid out. A lightweight titanium frame pack, compact medical supplies in waterproof containers, a suppressed M9 pistol, encrypted communications gear. Every ounce mattered. As she checked her equipment, a young Marine approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, I heard what you're doing. My squad leader is out there with Captain Morrison. Just bring them home, please." Sarah met his eyes and saw the same desperate hope she felt. "I'll bring them home, Marine. That's a promise." 2 hours later, as darkness fell over Fob Sentinel, Sarah Reeves stood at the perimeter gate. 40 pounds of gear pressed against her shoulders. The mountain pass stretched before her, disappearing into hostile territory. Behind her, Commander Hallbrook approached. "Last chance to back out, Corpsman." Sarah adjusted her night vision goggles and checked her GPS one final time. Somewhere out there, her brother and 279 other Marines were dying. The impossible mission was the only mission that mattered. "I'll see you in 12 hours, Commander, with 280 Marines." She stepped through the gate into the darkness, and the jungle swallowed her whole. The most dangerous infiltration of the war had begun, and there was no turning back. One woman, alone in enemy territory, racing against time and impossible odds to save an entire company. The clock was ticking. The jungle at night was alive with predators, and Sarah Reeves had just become prey. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, each footstep carefully placed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Through her night vision goggles, the world glowed an eerie green, turning familiar vegetation into an alien landscape of shadows and threats. The first 2 hours went smoothly, too smoothly. Sarah climbed steadily through the mountain pass, her breathing controlled despite the 40-pound pack cutting into her shoulders. The path was exactly as she remembered from her previous deployment: narrow, treacherous, with sheer drops on both sides that disappeared into blackness. One wrong step would mean a 100-foot fall onto rocks below. "Overwatch to Sentinel," she whispered into her radio, crouching behind a boulder. "First checkpoint reached, no contact, continuing north." "Copy, Overwatch," came Commander Hallbrook's voice, crackling with static. "Be advised, we're seeing increased enemy activity in your sector. Stay sharp." Sarah clicked twice in acknowledgement and kept moving. The temperature dropped as she climbed higher, her breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. Her legs burned with exertion, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Every minute counted. Then she heard it, voices speaking in rapid, harsh tones. She froze instantly, pressing herself against the rock face. Through the green glow of her night vision, she saw them. An enemy patrol, 6 men moving along a parallel path about 50 yards below her position. They were heavily armed, sweeping the area with flashlights. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Had they detected her? Were they searching specifically, or was this routine? She remained absolutely still, barely breathing as the patrol moved beneath her. One of the insurgents stopped, looking up toward her position. She could see his face clearly through her optics, young, alert, dangerous. He said something to his companions, and they all stopped. Sarah's hand moved slowly to her suppressed pistol. If they spotted her, she'd have to take them all down silently, an almost impossible task. Her finger found the trigger as the lead insurgent started climbing toward her position. 30 feet, 20 feet. Sarah could hear his labored breathing as he climbed, her muscles coiled, ready to spring. At 10 feet he paused, his flashlight beam sweeping the rocks just inches from where she hid. Then his radio crackled with urgent commands. After a brief conversation, he turned and scrambled back down to his team. Within seconds, the patrol moved off, disappearing into the jungle. Sarah released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That was too close. She waited a full 10 minutes before continuing, her nerves singing with adrenaline. By hour 4, she reached the cave system she'd identified on the maps. The entrance was partially concealed by vegetation, exactly as she remembered. She slipped inside, grateful for the brief respite from exposure. The cave was damp and cold, with water dripping from stalactites overhead. Using her red-filtered flashlight to preserve her night vision, she navigated through the twisting passages. Something moved in the darkness ahead. Sarah froze, her light catching the reflection of eyes, multiple pairs of them. Wild dogs drawn to the cave for shelter. They growled low, the sound echoing off stone walls. Sarah slowly backed away, speaking softly, trying not to trigger an attack. The pack leader stepped forward, teeth bared. She had no choice. Sarah pulled a ration bar from her pack and tossed it to the side. The dogs scrambled for it, fighting over the food, giving her precious seconds to slip past them deeper into the cave. Her heart raced as she heard them finishing the food behind her, their growls resuming. But she was already moving, finding the passage that would take her north. The cave system saved her nearly an hour of exposed travel, but it extracted a price. Her hands were scraped raw from climbing over sharp rocks. Her uniform was soaked from wading through underground streams. And when she finally emerged on the far side, dawn was beginning to break on the horizon. No, 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 Sarah muttered, checking her watch. She was behind schedule and daylight was her enemy. Moving through hostile territory during the day was exponentially more dangerous. She needed to cover another 5 miles to reach her brother's position, and now she'd have to do it in broad daylight. Sarah found a dense thicket and settled in, forcing herself to rest while the sun rose. She couldn't risk moving during full daylight. The enemy would spot her instantly. But every minute she waited was another minute her brother and his Marines suffered without help. She pulled out her medical supplies, doing a quick inventory. Antibiotics, check. IV fluids, check. Surgical kit, check. Everything was intact despite her harrowing journey. She allowed herself a sip of water and an energy bar, rationing carefully. The real test was still ahead. At 10:00 a.m., Sarah made a calculated decision. She couldn't wait for nightfall. The Marines didn't have that much time. She would have to move during the day, using every piece of cover available, and pray that luck stayed with her. She emerged from the thicket and immediately saw the problem. Between her position and the Marines' location lay a half-mile of relatively open ground, a former logging area with scattered trees but nowhere near enough cover for concealment. And worse, she could see an enemy convoy parked on the road that cut through the clearing. 3 trucks, maybe 20 soldiers, setting up what looked like a checkpoint. Sarah studied the situation through her binoculars. The convoy was directly in her path. Going around would add hours she didn't have. Going through meant crossing their line of sight in broad daylight. It was suicide either way. Then she noticed something. A shallow ravine cutting through the clearing, created by runoff during the rainy season. It was barely 3 feet deep, filled with mud and stagnant water, but it ran parallel to her route. If she could low-crawl through that ravine, staying below the sight line. It was insane, but so was this entire mission. Sarah waited, watching the enemy soldiers through her optics, timing their patrol patterns. Every 15 minutes they rotated positions. For approximately 90 seconds during each rotation, there was a gap in their coverage, a blind spot where the ravine wouldn't be under direct observation. She had one chance. At exactly 10:47 a.m., the enemy patrol began their rotation. Sarah burst from cover, sprinting low and fast toward the ravine. 50 yards, 40. She could hear voices from the checkpoint but didn't dare look. 20 yards. An engine started, someone was moving one of the trucks. 10 yards. She dove into the ravine just as the truck turned, its driver scanning the tree line she'd just left. Sarah pressed herself into the mud, every muscle screaming for oxygen, but she didn't dare breathe heavily. The truck rumbled past, so close she could have reached up and touched it. Then it was gone. Sarah began the most agonizing movement of her life, a low crawl through mud, filth, and stagnant water, pulling her 40-pound pack behind her. Every foot gained was torture. Her elbows and knees dug into rocks hidden in the muck. Something slithered past her leg, a snake, disturbed by her passage. She kept moving. The ravine stretched for nearly a quarter-mile. It took Sarah 45 minutes to traverse it, moving inches at a time whenever the enemy patrols weren't looking. Twice, Insurgents walked directly over the ravine, so close she could have grabbed their ankles. She remained motionless in the mud until they passed. Finally, mercifully, the ravine deepened and curved into a tree line. Sarah pulled herself out, covered head to toe in filth, gasping for air. She checked her GPS, 1 kilometer to the Marine's position. So close. But her relief was short-lived. Through the trees ahead, she heard the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire. Her brother's position was under attack. Sarah checked her watch, 12:15 p.m. She'd been in hostile territory for 11 hours and 45 minutes. She had 15 minutes left on her 12-hour timeline, and the final kilometer would be the most dangerous yet. Sarah grabbed her radio, preparing to make contact with the trapped Marines, when she heard boots crashing through the underbrush behind her. She spun, weapon raised, to see an enemy patrol, different from the one she'd evaded before, heading directly toward her position. They hadn't seen her yet, but they would in seconds. Sarah had nowhere to run. The ravine was behind her, the enemy checkpoint to her left, active combat to her right, and this patrol in front. She was trapped in the open, 1 kilometer from salvation, with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. Sarah pressed herself against a tree, her mind racing through options. She could try to take out the patrol silently, but any noise would alert the checkpoint. She could run, but they'd spot her immediately. She could hide, but there was no cover adequate enough. The patrol leader stopped, 20 feet away, speaking into his radio. He was looking directly at the tree she was hiding behind. Sarah's finger tightened on her trigger. After coming so far, surviving so much, it couldn't end like this. It couldn't. The patrol leader took a step toward her position, his weapon raised. Sarah's finger froze on the trigger, her breath caught in her throat. The patrol leader was 3 steps away from discovering her when his radio erupted with urgent commands. He stopped mid-stride, barking orders to his men. Through her limited understanding of the language, Sarah caught one word that made her blood run cold: attack. The enemy patrol suddenly turned and sprinted toward the sound of gunfire, toward her brother's position. They were launching a coordinated assault on the trapped Marines. Sarah watched them disappear into the jungle, then keyed her radio with shaking hands. Overwatch to stranded, overwatch to stranded, do you copy? Static answered her. She adjusted the frequency, trying again. Stranded, this is Overwatch. 1 click out, prepare for medical resupply. More static, then faintly breaking through the interference. Watch, this is ended, say again. It was her brother's voice. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. No time for emotion. Stranded, I am 1 kilometer south of your position, carrying medical supplies and comms equipment. I'm coming to you. Prepare a perimeter for my approach. A long pause. Then Morrison's voice came through clearly, disbelief evident even through the static. Overwatch, identify yourself. Sarah smiled grimly. It's Sarah, Jake, your baby sister, and I'm about to do something really stupid. She heard her brother's sharp intake of breath, followed by shouting as he relayed orders to his Marines. Negative, Overwatch. We are under heavy attack. Do not approach. I repeat, do not. Sarah switched off the radio and began moving. She could see the battlefield now through gaps in the trees. The Marines had established a desperate defensive perimeter on a small rise near the riverbank. Enemy forces were attacking from 3 sides, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show in the jungle. Between Sarah and her brother's position lay 250 meters of open ground, a killing field. She studied the terrain with a tactician's eye. The enemy was focused on the frontal assault, throwing everything at the Marine position. But their flanks were less protected, their attention divided. If she could time it right, use the chaos as cover. Through her binoculars, Sarah spotted Sergeant Chen working frantically on wounded Marines behind a fallen log. She saw her brother directing fire from a small crater, his uniform dark with blood. Whether his own or someone else's, she couldn't tell. The Marines were barely holding on. Sarah stripped off her pack, redistributing the critical supplies into a smaller assault pack. She cached the rest under a fallen tree, marking the GPS coordinates. Lighter now, carrying only the essentials, medical supplies, radio, one magazine for her pistol, she prepared for the sprint of her life. A massive explosion rocked the marine perimeter. An enemy RPG had found its mark, and Sarah saw 3 Marines thrown into the air. Chen was scrambling toward them, exposed to enemy fire. The Marines' defensive line was buckling. It was now or never. Sarah broke from the tree line at a dead sprint, her legs pumping as she zigzagged across the open ground. For the first 50 meters, the chaos of battle concealed her approach. Then an insurgent on the enemy's flank spotted her, a lone figure running toward the Marines. "Contact, runner!" The shout went up in their language, and suddenly gunfire swung in her direction. Bullets snapped past her head like angry hornets. The ground exploded around her feet as enemy shooters found their range. Sarah didn't slow down. She couldn't. Ahead, she saw Marines recognize what was happening. Someone was trying to reach them through the firestorm. "Covering fire," Morrison's voice roared over the battlefield. "Lay down covering fire on the south flank." The Marines opened up with everything they had, suppressing the enemy positions targeting Sarah. Machine gun tracers crisscrossed the air above her head as she ran, the Marines firing danger close to provide cover. She could feel the heat of passing bullets, hear them cracking through the air. 100 meters to go. An enemy soldier rose from cover directly in her path, weapon raised. Sarah drew her pistol mid-stride and fired twice. The suppressed weapon coughed and the insurgent dropped. She didn't break pace. 75 meters. An RPG streaked across her path, missing by inches. The backblast nearly knocked her off her feet, but she stumbled forward, regaining her balance. 50 meters. She could see individual Marines now, their faces a mixture of shock and hope. A young private was shouting encouragement, firing his rifle to cover her approach. 25 meters. A bullet grazed her shoulder, spinning her partially around. Pain exploded through her arm, but adrenaline kept her moving. She could see Jake now, standing exposed, firing over her head at enemies behind her. 10 meters. The world seemed to slow down. Sarah saw an enemy grenade arc through the air, tumbling end over end, landing directly in her path. She had maybe 2 seconds before it detonated. Without thinking, Sarah dove forward, her body going horizontal as the grenade exploded behind her. The shockwave lifted her off the ground and threw her the final distance like a rag doll. She hit the ground hard inside the marine perimeter, rolling several times before slamming into a tree. Strong hands grabbed her, dragging her behind cover as bullets tore through the space she just occupied. Sarah looked up through blurred vision to see her brother's face, streaked with mud and disbelief. "You're insane," Jake Morrison shouted, but he was grinning even as tears streaked through the dirt on his face. "Absolutely insane." Sarah coughed, tasting blood, and struggled to sit up. "Yeah, well, it runs in the family." She shrugged off her assault pack, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. "I brought medicine." Around them, Marines were staring in amazement. Sergeant Chen crawled over, her eyes wide. "Please tell me that pack has antibiotics." "Antibiotics, IV fluids, surgical supplies, and—" Sarah pulled out the encrypted radio, a direct line to Fob Sentinel. "We're calling in the cavalry." A cheer went up from the nearby Marines, quickly silenced by Morrison. "Save the celebration. We're still under attack." But even as he shouted orders, his hand squeezed Sarah's good shoulder. "Glad you made it, little sister." "Couldn't let you have all the fun," Sarah replied, already moving toward the wounded despite her own injury. She and Chen worked in tandem, Sarah's fresh supplies bringing immediate hope to the critical casualties. While they worked, Sarah set up the communications array behind cover, her hands shaking from adrenaline and pain. The equipment had survived her explosive entrance miraculously intact. She extended the antenna, adjusted the frequency, and keyed the transmit button. Stranded to Sentinel, stranded to Sentinel. This is Overwatch. I have reached the package. Repeat, I have reached the package and established comms. Request immediate fire support and extraction over. Commander Hallbrook's voice came through crystal clear, thick with emotion. Copy, Overwatch, damn good work. Be advised, fast movers are already inbound to your position. ETA 8 minutes. Extraction birds will follow. Hold your position. Sarah slumped against the tree, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. 11 hours through enemy territory, a suicide sprint across open ground under fire, and now this, holding a desperate position until rescue arrived. She looked around at the Marines, filthy, bleeding, exhausted, but still fighting, still alive. Private Rodriguez, the Marine with the sucking chest wound, grabbed her hand weakly. You came for us." Sarah squeezed his hand back, injecting antibiotics into his IV line. "Always, Marine. We don't leave our people behind." The enemy assault intensified, sensing that something had changed. They were throwing everything at the Marine position now, trying to overwhelm them before help arrived. Morrison coordinated the defense brilliantly, shifting his limited forces to meet each new threat. Sarah worked through the casualties with Chen, stabilizing the worst cases. Her shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, but she ignored it. These men had held out for days without help. She could handle a few more minutes of pain. "Overwatch, this is Phantom 7, a new voice crackled over the radio. "We have eyes on your position, preparing to engage enemy forces. Danger close. Keep your heads down." Sarah grabbed the handset. "Phantom 7, cleared hot. Hit everything that's not behind our perimeter." "Copy, commencing gun run." The sound started as a distant roar, growing rapidly into an earth-shaking thunder. Two F-18 Super Hornets screamed overhead, so low Sarah could feel the heat from their engines. The jungle erupted as their cannons tore into enemy positions, 20 rounds shredding everything in their path. The enemy assault faltered, then broke. Insurgents scattered, running for cover as the jets made another pass, dropping precision munitions on their heavy weapons positions. Secondary explosions lit up the jungle as ammunition stores cooked off. "All stranded elements, this is Rescue 6, a new voice came over the radio. 2 Apache and 4 Black Hawks inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Prepare for hot extraction." Morrison began organizing the Marines, prioritizing the wounded for evacuation. Sarah and Chen worked frantically to prepare casualties for transport, stabilizing them enough to survive the helicopter ride. Then Sarah heard it, the beautiful, unmistakable sound of approaching helicopters. The thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting through humid air. She looked up to see 2 Apache gunships crest the ridge, their chin-mounted cannons already spinning up. "Here comes the cavalry," she whispered. The Apache unleashed hell. The Apache gunships were avenging angels. Their 30-chain guns roared to life, spitting hundreds of rounds per second into enemy positions. Trees disintegrated. Rock formations exploded into dust. Any insurgent foolish enough to remain exposed was cut down instantly. The Apache flew in coordinated patterns, one providing cover while the other repositioned, creating an impenetrable wall of firepower around the trapped Marines. "Black Hawks inbound, 30 seconds, Morrison shouted over the deafening noise. He grabbed Sarah's arm. "You're on the first bird with the critical casualties." "Not a chance," Sarah shouted back, injecting morphine into a screaming Marine with a mangled leg. "Critical wounded go first, I go last, that's the rule." "Sarah, you've been shot." "It's a graze, these men are dying." She didn't look up, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Chen and I need to stay until everyone's loaded. You know I'm right." Morrison cursed but knew she was correct. "Fine, but you're on bird 3, no arguments." The first Black Hawk descended through a storm of rotor wash and gunfire, its door gunners laying down suppressive fire. Before the skids even touched ground, Marines were rushing forward with stretchers. The crew chief waved frantically, directing the organized chaos. "Go, go, go," Sergeant Chen shouted, helping load Private Rodriguez. His chest wound was stabilized, but he needed surgery within hours or the infection would kill him. "You're going home, Rodriguez. Stay with me." 8 casualties loaded in 45 seconds. The Black Hawk lifted off, its engines screaming as it climbed away from the kill zone. 1 bird down, 3 to go, with over 60 wounded still waiting. But the enemy wasn't finished. Through the smoke and chaos, Sarah saw insurgents massing for one final desperate assault. They knew if the Marines escaped, their ambush would be a failure. RPG teams moved into position on the high ground, targeting the incoming helicopters. "RPG's 3 o'clock high," someone screamed. An Apache immediately swung around, its pilot spotting the threat. Hellfire missiles streaked from its weapon pods, impacting the ridge in massive explosions. But more insurgents appeared, replacing the ones killed. They were willing to die to stop the evacuation. The second Black Hawk came in hot, taking small arms fire from multiple directions. A round punched through its fuselage, missing the pilot by inches. The door gunner returned fire, his minigun creating a cone of tracers that swept across enemy positions. Sarah worked like a machine, her medical training taking over completely. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, IV lines. Each Marine prepared for evacuation with ruthless efficiency. Her shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed her, blood soaking through her uniform, but she didn't slow down. "Sergeant Chen, I need your hands," Sarah called out, struggling with a Marine whose shrapnel wounds were bleeding through the bandages. Chen appeared instantly, her own hands shaking from exhaustion but still steady enough for the delicate work. Together, they clamped a severed artery, buying the Marine precious time. The second helicopter loaded and lifted off, taking another group of wounded to safety. But as it climbed, an RPG streaked toward it from the jungle. The pilot saw it coming and yanked the helicopter into a violent, evasive maneuver. The rocket missed by less than 10 feet, exploding harmlessly in the air. "That was too close," Morrison muttered, watching the bird escape. He grabbed his rifle as enemy soldiers broke from cover, attempting a ground assault on the perimeter. "Here they come. All positions fire." The remaining Marines opened up, their ammunition running critically low but their discipline holding firm. Young Private Jenkins, who'd been terrified during the initial ambush, now fired with cold precision, dropping insurgents with practiced headshots. The week of hell had transformed frightened boys into hardened warriors. An explosion rocked the perimeter, a mortar round landing dangerously close. Sarah felt the shockwave slam into her, throwing her against a tree. Her ears rang, vision blurred, but she forced herself to move. A Marine lay nearby, unconscious from the blast. She crawled to him, checking his pulse, his breathing. Concussion, but alive. "Third bird incoming," Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. "Prepare the next group." The Black Hawk descended through a firestorm. An Apache escort wheeled overhead, its pilot performing impossible maneuvers to shield the transport helicopter. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky like deadly fireflies. The crew chief hung out the door, directing the pilot with hand signals as bullets sparked off the helicopter's armor. Sarah and Chen loaded casualties with mechanical efficiency, their bodies running on pure adrenaline. Each Marine who boarded was one more life saved, one more family that wouldn't receive the worst notification imaginable. But then Sarah saw him, Corporal Hayes, the scout who'd mapped their impossible situation days ago. He was hit, a sucking chest wound identical to Rodriguez's. But unlike Rodriguez, Hayes had been waiting too long. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was going into shock. "Chen, I need you now," Sarah screamed, but the third helicopter was already lifting off, its maximum capacity reached. Hayes wouldn't survive the wait for the fourth bird. Without hesitation, Sarah made the decision that would haunt her forever. She grabbed her medical kit and performed an emergency needle decompression, puncturing Hayes's chest cavity to release trapped air. It was a desperate procedure, done under fire with minimal equipment. Hayes gasped, his eyes focusing on her. Am I gonna make it? Sarah looked into his young face. He couldn't be more than 22 and lied with complete conviction. You're going to be fine, Corporal, just stay with me. She worked frantically, establishing an IV line, pumping fluids, doing everything possible to stabilize him. But she could see the signs: internal bleeding, collapsed lung. Without immediate surgery, Hayes had minutes, maybe less. The fourth Black Hawk appeared through the smoke, and Sarah made another impossible choice. She grabbed Morrison. "Jake, I need you to listen to me. Hayes goes on this bird front of the line. I don't care what anyone else's injuries are. Hayes goes now." Morrison saw the look in her eyes and understood. "Chen, help me get Hayes loaded. Move." They carried the semi-conscious Marine to the helicopter. Sarah climbed aboard with him, holding pressure on his wounds, whispering encouragement. The crew chief tried to pull her back. "Ma'am, you need to stay for the command element." "He dies without me," Sarah snarled with such ferocity that the crew chief backed off. She turned to Morrison, still standing on the ground. "Get everyone else out, Jake. That's an order from your little sister." Morrison's face showed a mixture of pride and terror. "You better make it home, Sarah." "You too, big brother." The Black Hawk lifted off with Sarah aboard, her hands desperately working to keep Hayes alive. Below, Morrison turned back to his remaining Marines, maybe 40 men still waiting for the final helicopter. The Apache were running low on ammunition, their guns firing in shorter bursts. But Sarah couldn't think about that now. Hayes's pulse was weakening under her fingers. "Stay with me, Hayes. Don't you dare die on me." The helicopter banked hard, evading ground fire. Through the open door, Sarah could see the battlefield falling away, the river that had trapped her brother's company, the jungle that had nearly killed her, the desperate perimeter where Marines still fought. Hayes's eyes found hers. "Tell my mom, tell her I tried." "You're going to tell her yourself." Sarah increased the fluid rate, but she knew it wasn't enough. Hayes was bleeding internally faster than she could replace the blood. His hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "Thank you for coming for us." His pulse stopped. "No, no, no, no." Sarah began chest compressions, her shoulders screaming in protest. The crew chief moved to help, but they both knew it was over. Hayes had held on as long as he could, but the jungle had claimed one more victim. Sarah continued compressions anyway, refusing to accept defeat, even as the helicopter raced toward Fob Sentinel. She compressed Hayes's chest mechanically, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving in silent prayer or curse. She didn't even know which anymore. The crew chief gently touched her arm. "Ma'am, he's gone." Sarah's hands finally stopped. She sat back, staring at Hayes's still face, and something inside her cracked. She'd crossed enemy territory alone, survived impossible odds, reached the Marines against all logic, and it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Behind her, through the open door, she could see the battlefield shrinking in the distance. The final Black Hawk was descending to extract Morrison and the last Marines. The Apache circled like protective hawks, their ammunition nearly exhausted. Sarah closed Hayes's eyes gently and said a prayer she'd learned as a child. Then she radioed Morrison. "Stranded, this is Overwatch. Hayes didn't make it. Get everyone else out. Whatever it takes." Her brother's voice came back, steady despite the chaos. "Copy, Overwatch, we're coming home." The helicopter banked toward Fob Sentinel, carrying the living and the dead, while behind them the final chapter of the rescue unfolded. The final Black Hawk descended into hell. Morrison watched it approach through smoke and chaos, knowing this was their last chance. 40 Marines remained on the ground, the command element the rear guard, and those too stubborn to leave until every other man was safe. They'd held this blood-soaked piece of jungle for 3 days, and now, finally, extraction was within reach. But the enemy knew it too. RPGs, multiple teams positioning on the ridge, Sergeant Reed shouted, his voice hoarse from days of shouting orders and breathing gun smoke. Morrison saw them, at least a dozen insurgent teams rushing into position, their rocket-propelled grenades aimed at the incoming helicopter. If even one connected, the bird would go down, and everyone aboard would die. The Apache had expended most of their ammunition holding off previous assaults. They had maybe one more gun run left before they'd be firing on empty chambers. Apache lead, this is stranded actual, Morrison barked into the radio. We've got RPG teams lighting up the LZ. Need immediate suppression, danger close. Copy stranded, we're Winchester on Hellfires, going guns only, recommend you get real low. The Apache gunships dove toward the ridge like eagles striking prey, their 13 cannons roaring. The enemy positions erupted in clouds of dust and shredded vegetation, but there were too many targets and not enough bullets. Several RPG teams survived the strafing run and fired. 3 rockets streaked toward the descending Black Hawk simultaneously. The pilot, a veteran named Captain Torres who'd flown more combat missions than anyone could count, threw the helicopter into a violent sideslip. The first RPG missed by inches. The second detonated against a tree, showering the bird with shrapnel. The third. "Brace!" the crew chief screamed. The rocket struck the Black Hawk's tail rotor. The explosion wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough. The helicopter began spinning violently, its damaged tail unable to provide stability. Torres fought the controls with everything he had, forcing the bird into a controlled crash rather than a death spiral. The Black Hawk slammed into the ground 20 yards from Morrison's position, its landing gear collapsing, rotor blades chewing into earth. Sparks flew from damaged electrical systems, but miraculously, it didn't explode. "Move, get to that bird," Morrison commanded, already sprinting toward the downed helicopter. His Marines followed, laying down covering fire as they ran. Torres and his crew scrambled out, weapons ready despite the crash. "We can't fly, but the bird's still got working guns," he shouted to Morrison. "Get your men aboard. We'll provide covering fire during extract." "Aboard what?" Morrison demanded. "You just crashed." Torres grinned fiercely. "The other birds are coming back for us. They're not leaving anyone behind. Now get your Marines in position and prepare for the fight of your life, Captain." As if summoned by his words, the radio crackled. "All elements, this is Rescue 6. Be advised, all Black Hawks are returning to extract remaining personnel. ETA 3 minutes. Apache lead reports Winchester on all weapons. You're on your own until we arrive." 3 minutes. The Apache were out of ammunition. The enemy was massing for a final, overwhelming assault, and Morrison's 40 Marines had maybe 2 magazines each remaining. The math was simple and brutal. "Form a perimeter around the downed bird," Morrison ordered. "Every round counts. Fire discipline, controlled pairs only." The Marines moved into position with the precision of men who'd been through hell together. Young Jenkins took position behind the Black Hawk's damaged landing gear, his rifle steady despite hands that trembled from exhaustion. Sergeant Reed checked ammunition counts, redistributing bullets from those with more to those with less. Even the helicopter crew integrated into the defensive line, their pistols and carbines adding to the Marines' firepower. Then the enemy attacked. They came from everywhere at once, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the position before rescue could arrive. Hundreds of insurgents poured from the jungle, firing as they advanced. It was a suicide charge, and they knew it, but they were committed to destroying the Marines who'd embarrassed them for 3 days. "Fire, fire!" Morrison's rifle barked steadily, each shot finding its mark. Around him, his Marines fought with desperate courage. The volume of return fire was incredible for 40 men, every Marine shooting with practiced precision, making every bullet count. Private Jenkins dropped 3 insurgents in rapid succession, his fear transformed into cold efficiency. "I'm out," he shouted, releasing his empty magazine. Here, Corporal Santos tossed him her last magazine. "Make it count." Jenkins reloaded and continued firing, tears streaming down his face but his hands rock steady. This was for Williams, for Thompson, for Peterson, for every Marine who hadn't made it. For Hayes, who died in the helicopter minutes ago. This was for all of them. An insurgent made it within 20 yards before Sergeant Reed cut him down. Another threw a grenade that landed near Morrison's position. The captain scooped it up and hurled it back in one fluid motion, diving for cover as it detonated among enemy forces. The downed Black Hawk's door gunner had managed to get his minigun operational despite the crash. The weapon roared to life, its 6 rotating barrels spitting 4,000 rounds per minute into the attacking mass. Insurgents fell in waves, but still they came. "I'm Winchester," Jenkins shouted, his rifle's bolt locked back on an empty chamber. He drew his knife, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. Here, Captain Torres threw him a pistol from the helicopter's emergency kit. 15 rounds. Use them wisely. Morrison checked his own ammunition. 1 magazine left, 15 rounds. He looked at his Marines, saw their faces, exhausted, terrified, but unbroken. They'd survived 3 days in hell. They weren't giving up now. Then, cutting through the chaos, Morrison heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Approaching helicopters. Not 1 or 2, but multiple birds, their rotor blades thundering across the valley. "They're coming back," Reed shouted. "The whole damn cavalry's coming back." Through the smoke, Morrison saw them. All 3 Black Hawks that had already made successful trips, now returning for the final extraction. They were empty, flying light, able to maneuver more aggressively. And behind them, 2 more Apache appeared, fresh from FOB Sentinel, their weapons pods fully loaded. "All stranded elements, this is Rescue 6, the lead pilot's voice was calm despite the chaos. "We're coming in hot. Clear the LZ for multiple bird landing. Prepare for immediate dust-off." The fresh Apache opened fire, their Hellfire missiles streaking into enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The tide of the assault faltered as insurgents suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of overwhelming firepower. Those who tried to fall back were cut down by the Apache chain guns. The 3 Black Hawks descended simultaneously, their formation creating a wall of rotor wash that flattened the grass and threw up blinding clouds of dust. Morrison had never seen such an aggressive extraction. 3 birds landing in a space designed for 1, their rotors passing within feet of each other, pilots displaying suicidal bravery. "Load, load, load," Morrison screamed, directing Marines to different helicopters. The wounded first, then the rear guard, everyone moving with desperate speed. The crew chief from the first bird, a grizzled sergeant with 30 years of service, jumped out and ran to the crashed helicopter. "Torres, can you walk?" "Yeah, but my bird's done." "Then get your crew and let's go. We're not leaving million-dollar equipment or anyone behind." The crews worked together, pulling sensitive equipment from the downed helicopter while Marines provided covering fire. An enemy machine gun opened up from the tree line, bullets sparking off the helicopter's fuselage. The door gunner from the 2nd Black Hawk silenced it with a sustained burst. Morrison counted heads as his Marines boarded, 37, 38, 39, almost there. Sergeant Reed appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, you're on this bird. I'll take the last one." "The hell you will." Morrison grabbed Reed and physically threw him toward the nearest helicopter. "Get aboard, that's an order." Jenkins was the last Marine waiting, his young face smoke-blackened but determined. Morrison pushed him toward the final Black Hawk. "Move, Marine." "Not without you, sir." Morrison looked at the kid who'd been terrified during the ambush, who'd grown into a warrior over 3 days of hell. He grabbed Jenkins and they ran together, diving into the helicopter as its skids lifted off the ground. The Black Hawk was already climbing when Morrison pulled himself fully aboard. Below, the jungle fell away, the river that had trapped them, the perimeter they defended with blood and bullets, the position where so many had died. Beside him, Jenkins was crying openly now, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Morrison put a hand on the young Marine's shoulder. "You did good, kid. You all did good." The three Black Hawks flew in tight formation, the Apache escort on either side. Morrison counted one more time, his heart in his throat, 40 Marines, Torres and his crew. Everyone who was alive when the extraction started had made it aboard. Behind them, secondary explosions lit up the jungle as the fresh Apache destroyed the crashed Black Hawk to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The sound of battle faded, replaced by the steady thump of rotor blades carrying them home. Morrison keyed his radio one final time. "Rescue 6, this is stranded actual. All personnel extracted. We're coming home." The response came from Commander Holbrook herself, her voice thick with emotion. "Copy stranded actual. Well done. Well done." As Fob Sentinel appeared on the horizon, Morrison closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for the fallen, for Hayes, for Williams, for Thompson, for all those who wouldn't make this flight. They'd held for 3 impossible days, and now, finally, the survivors were going home. The Black Hawks crossed into friendly airspace, but no one celebrated. The Marines sat in stunned silence, their 1,000-yard stares fixed on nothing. Some trembled uncontrollably. Others wept quietly. Jenkins clutched his empty rifle like a lifeline, his knuckles white, unable to process that the fighting was finally over. Morrison looked at his men, these warriors who'd survived the impossible. 3 days ago, he'd commanded 280 Marines. Now, as Fob Sentinel's lights appeared through the helicopter's open door, he was bringing home 267. 13 brothers weren't coming back. The number felt like a weight crushing his chest. The landing zone at Fob Sentinel was unlike anything Morrison had ever seen. Hundreds of personnel lined the tarmac in absolute silence. Marines, sailors, airmen, even civilian contractors. Word had spread about the trapped company, about the female medic who'd crossed enemy lines alone, about the desperate extraction. Every person on base had come to witness their return. The first Black Hawk touched down and Sarah stepped out, her uniform still covered in Hayes's blood. Her shoulder wound had been bandaged during the flight, but she moved stiffly, pain evident in every step. Commander Holbrook rushed forward, but Sarah waved her off, scanning the other helicopters frantically. The second bird landed, then the third. Marines stumbled out, many requiring assistance, all of them looking shell-shocked. Sarah searched every face desperately until she saw him, Jake Morrison, climbing down from the final helicopter alive. She didn't remember running. One moment she was standing by the first bird, the next she was in her brother's arms, both of them holding each other so tightly neither could breathe. No words. There were no words for what they'd survived. "You crazy, stupid brave." Jake's voice broke and he couldn't finish. "I know," Sarah whispered, "I know." Around them, the entire base maintained their respectful silence, allowing the survivors this moment. Medical personnel moved forward slowly, treating the wounded with gentle efficiency. Stretchers appeared for those who couldn't walk, but everyone moved quietly, understanding that these Marines needed time to process that they were truly safe. Private Rodriguez, stabilized from his chest wound, was wheeled past on a gurney. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand. "You saved us," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "We saved each other." The next hours blurred together. Medical examinations, debriefings, official reports. Sarah moved through it mechanically, her body operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to catch up with what had happened. Somewhere during the medical exam, a doctor told her the bullet graze on her shoulder had missed major arteries by millimeters. She nodded, feeling nothing. What was one bullet wound compared to everything else? It was Sergeant Chen who finally broke through her shock. The combat medic found Sarah sitting alone in the medical bay at 300 hours, staring at her blood-stained hands. "Hayes?" Chen asked quietly, sitting beside her. "Gone, I couldn't," Sarah's voice cracked. "I did everything right, Chen, everything by the book, and it wasn't enough." "You saved 267 lives," Chen said firmly. 267 Marines are alive because you crossed enemy lines alone, because you brought medicine, because you called in that extraction. She grabbed Sarah's hands. "Hayes knew the risks. We all did. But those 267 men, they're going home to their families because of you." Sarah looked up, meeting Chen's eyes. "How do you carry it, the ones we couldn't save?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "We remember them, we honor their sacrifice, and we keep fighting for the ones we can save." She paused. "Hayes's last words, he thanked you for coming for them, that's what you hold on to." 3 weeks later, the awards ceremony took place under a blazing sun. The entire base assembled in dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation. Sarah stood at attention beside Jake, both siblings looking uncomfortable in the spotlight. Commander Hallbrook read the citation. "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Navy Corpsman Second Class Sarah Reeves, serving with Marine forces in hostile territory, voluntarily undertook a solo infiltration through 12 miles of enemy-controlled terrain to reach a trapped Marine company. Crossing enemy lines alone, Corpsman Reeves delivered critical medical supplies and communications equipment that directly saved numerous lives and enabled the successful extraction of 267 Marines. Sarah barely heard the words. Her eyes were fixed on the memorial wall visible across the base. 13 new names had been carved into the stone that morning. Williams, Thompson, Peterson, Hayes, 9 others who died in the ambush and crossing. Their faces haunted her dreams. The Navy Cross was pinned to her uniform, the blue and white ribbon stark against her dress blues. Jake received a silver star for his leadership during the siege. Sergeant Chen received a bronze star with valor. Captain Torres and his crew were decorated for their bravery during the extraction. But Sarah felt like a fraud. Heroes didn't watch Marines die in their arms. Heroes didn't make it home when others didn't. After the ceremony, families gathered, wives, children, parents of the survivors. Sarah watched Jake reunite with his wife and 2 daughters, the girls squealing as their father lifted them into the air. Around her, similar scenes played out across the base, joy and relief and gratitude mixing with the grief for those who weren't there. Then she saw them, Hayes's mother and father, standing by the memorial wall, their son's name still looking too fresh on the stone. Sarah's feet carried her toward them before her brain could intervene. Mrs. Hayes turned as Sarah approached, recognition flickering in her red-rimmed eyes. "You're her, the medic who tried to save my son." Sarah's rehearsed condolences died in her throat. "I'm so sorry, I tried everything, Mrs. Hayes pulled her into a fierce embrace. "The Marines told us what you did, that you stayed with him, that he wasn't alone." She pulled back, gripping Sarah's shoulders. Thank you for being there when we couldn't." Sarah broke. All the composure, all the military bearing, all the strength that had carried her through enemy territory and impossible odds, it shattered. She wept in the arms of a woman whose son she'd failed to save, and somehow found the grace she'd been seeking. Mr. Hayes spoke quietly. "Our son wrote us letters. In his last one, received 2 days before the ambush, he mentioned Captain Morrison and Sergeant Chen. He said he was proud to serve with such good people." He looked at Sarah's Navy Cross. "He would have been proud to know you came for them. That means something." As the sun set over Fob Sentinel, Sarah stood before the memorial wall alone. 13 names, 13 families torn apart, but also 267 lives saved, 267 families that still had their Marines. She traced Hayes's name with her finger and made a promise. The same promise she'd made during the extraction, but now it felt different, permanent. "I won't forget," she whispered. "Any of you, and I'll keep fighting for every life I can save, for every Marine who needs help. That's my promise." Behind her, Jake approached silently, standing beside his sister. They stood together in the fading light, two siblings who'd faced death and brought each other home. "You know what Mom would say," Jake finally spoke. Sarah smiled slightly. "That we're both too stubborn to know when to quit." "That we're Reeves," Jake corrected, "and Reeves never leave their people behind." They stood in silence as taps played across the base, the mournful notes carrying across the evening air. 13 Marines lost, 267 saved. One impossible mission completed against all odds. Sarah touched her Navy cross, feeling its weight. Not the weight of metal and ribbon, but the weight of responsibility, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond formed between those who faced death together. She'd crossed enemy lines alone to save 280 Marines. She'd brought 267 home. And she'd carry all 280 with her for the rest of her life. The living and the dead, the saved and the lost, all of them part of her story now. As darkness fell and the base settled into evening routine, Sarah made one final decision. Tomorrow, she'd request reassignment back to a combat medical unit. There were more Marines out there who might need someone crazy enough to cross enemy lines for them. Because that's what you did for family. And every Marine was family. The end.